Ladies and gentlemen, Maramutse, bonjour, boker tov. 1 week ago, at the United Nations, in Israel, Latin America, Europe, and elsewhere, B'nai B'rith marked International Holocaust Remembrance Day and the 75th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi death camp, Auschwitz. One of the remarkable things about the hell on earth called Auschwitz is how actually unremarkable it became on this planet, on the European continent, in its time, our own time. Auschwitz, for all its well-earned infamy, was one of virtually countless extermination camps and other sites of the mass murder of Jews as well as non-Jews deemed the wrong type of human beings. But this is, as we know, for those who haven't witnessed or experienced it, and perhaps also those who have, practically unfathomable. 6 million ordinary people, Jewish civilians, citizens, children, women, and men were murdered in some 6 years. Here in Rwanda, some 1 million civilians, Tutsi and others, were massacred in just 3 months. This is aside from all the uncounted victims, the survivors, the injured, scarred, and traumatized, whose physical and psychic wounds last not months or years, but a lifetime, then altering the circumstances and the very consciousness even of generations to come. Now, and as Alan, my senior colleague, mentioned, I and we are not here to assert perfect parallels between different tragedies, different outrages, any more than we can try to calculate the immeasurable worth of any human life. Each harrowing event of massive persecution, including ethnic cleansing, genocide, and other crimes against humanity, can have key commonalities with others while also differing in targets, scope, methodology, and more. The Rwandan experience of 1994 was as unfathomable as any other monumental atrocity. Reflection on it, however, can be uniquely useful, if I dare use that term. Many films and certainly documentaries about the Holocaust, likely the most systematic and documented genocide in history, appear in black and white, as if from a different reality, a different universe, a different and unrelatable period in history. But here, the senseless and barbaric bloodshed took place in 1994. I was alive in 1994. I remember 1994. Becoming a bar mitzvah, a Jewish life milestone at the Western Wall in Jerusalem, the relic of Judaism's holiest place, I experienced innocence, safety, and hope in 1994. So no, 1994 again reminded and reminds us the capacity of human beings to hate human beings to the point of contemplating and executing genocide is real. It is here, in our era and our world. It happened in Africa, it happened in Europe, it can happen anywhere again, and we have to do everything we can to prevent it. I have so much more to learn about the genocide against the Tutsi over the course of this day and also after it. For this moment, I hope you'll allow me to speak briefly to the Jewish experience. And as someone who, by the grace of God, has had the opportunity to exist and to speak in this place far from my own home to survivors and fellow descendants of survivors. In 1945, 75 years ago, my mother's parents found themselves, astonishingly, alive. Of the roughly 3.3 million Jews who lived in Poland, where they had been present for at least a millennium, when Germany invaded in 1939, only about 350,000, some 10%, remained alive in 1945. My maternal grandmother survived in difficult conditions in Siberia, and my grandfather survived, despite being shot in the back, by hiding. Virtually his entire family and community were eradicated, and some, if not many of them, were killed not even by Germans, but by Polish Catholic neighbors and supposed friends. But he was rescued by an ordinary yet also clearly extraordinary Polish Catholic couple whom I later would have the chance to meet. They did so at acute risk to their own life and came very close to losing it. So even amid horror, as we know, can be found glimmers of inspiration, decency, and heroism. But let's make no mistake about the overall picture we confront in chapters such as the Holocaust. These are ones of darkness. In the Passover Haggadah, read by Jews to commemorate our exodus from slavery in ancient Egypt, we are told, in every generation there are those who rise up to destroy us, but the Holy One, blessed is He, saves us from their hands. To understand the Holocaust, as James so eloquently summarized it, to understand the causes and the possibility of genocide, we have to understand that it did not and does not ever happen in a vacuum. Fanatical, violent anti-Semitism, one of the oldest and most durable forms of prejudice, was fomented long before 1939, and it continued after 1945 until this very day. It alternately took the form, as James noted, of hatred on religious grounds, on so-called racial grounds, on economic grounds, and on political grounds. For all the friends that we have had, friends like James, friends like all of you, and thank God, we've always had some of those too. We Jews have been hated for being too religious and too secular, hated for being too rich and too poor, hated for being too strong and too weak, hated for being capitalist and hated for being socialist, hated for being conservative and for being liberal, hated for being segregated and different, and hated for being assimilated and too alike. Hated since being exiled by imperial Rome for being dispersed, and hated for restoring sovereignty in our small ancestral homeland, Israel. Perhaps the cross-historical quandary of Jews is best exemplified by Holocaust survivors who can still remember European shouts of "Go back to Palestine," that name given Israel, the Holy Land, by the Romans, only to now hear demands of "Get out of Palestine." Today, in fact, it has often become acceptable, rather than expressing hostility or indifference to Jews, to instead direct these merely at all Israelis or Zionists. But this doesn't quite hold up when no less than half of the world's total Jewish population calls Israel home, and Zionism remains nothing more or less than acceptance of Jews' basic right to equality, security, and self-determination. Of course, our discussions today are not about politics, and to be clear, I believe strongly, as does my organization, in the basic rights of both Israelis and Palestinians, Jews and Arabs. But as the human rights icon Natan Sharansky has said, and this has been reflected in the critical working definition of anti-Semitism of the Intergovernmental International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, anti-Israelism manifests anti-Semitism when it subjects the world's only Jewish state and the Middle East's only democracy to the 3 Ds: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. When for political reasons, the United Nations ritually condemns Israel, one of the smallest countries on the planet, not only more than any of the world's most egregious violators of human rights, but more than all other 192 member states combined. Something is wrong with the system, and something is wrong with a simplistic zero-sum view of victimhood and of justice. When, in an epitomizing of insult added to injury, pluralistic Israel is accused of apartheid, of ethnic cleansing, and even of Nazi-like genocide, the meaning of those terms is gutted, along with honest, let alone civil, discourse. After all, since Israel's establishment in 1948, the number of Jews in Arab countries across the Middle East has gone down from 850,000 to less than 5,000, while the number of Palestinians in the Holy Land has increased over the same period from some 1.3 million to over 6 million. If Israel has intended or attempted ethnic cleansing over the past 72 years, it is, despite its much-touted strength, unparalleled in its ineptitude. Innumerably fewer Arabs have been killed by Israel in 72 years than have been killed by their own leaders over the past decade alone. And Arab citizens enjoy vastly greater civil liberty in Israel than they do in neighboring Arab countries. Yet the narrative of Israel as oppressor, of Jews as the new Nazis, is widespread and it's devastating. Traditional neo-fascist and white supremacist ideologies are exceeded by extreme anti-Zionism as the most prevalent fuel for lethal anti-Semitism today, certainly in the form of never-ending terrorism against civilians in Israel, but also anti-Jewish attacks in the diaspora, where in multiple countries, Jews are, despite their minuscule numbers, by far the leading target of faith-based hate crimes. It can be no surprise then, notwithstanding the existence without question of moderate and tolerant Muslims from Albania to Azerbaijan to Rwanda and far beyond, when Pew Forum surveys find animosity rates toward Jews, not simply Israel, but Jews, of 90%, 90% or more in many majority Muslim countries. What is shocking, or should be, is when international bodies and news outlets call jihadists terrorists in all other contexts, but not the one in which civilians are targeted for bombings, for shootings, and for stabbings, only account of their being Jews. What is shocking is when leaders in Iran hold cartoon competitions to deny or mock the Holocaust, even while threatening a new one by sponsoring terror and ritualizing public pledges, open pledges of death to Israel, wipe Israel off the map. What is shocking, or should be, is when the Prime Minister of Malaysia, a country that has no territorial or political disputes whatsoever with Israel, many thousands of kilometers away, proudly, openly labels himself in our century, in our time, an anti-Semite, promotes caricatures of hook-nosed Jews, echoes the conspiracy theory of Jewish world domination, and refuses even to allow disabled Paralympic athletes to enter his country because their nationality happens to be Israeli. What is shocking, or should be, is that Palestinian political discourse, religious sermons, media rhetoric, and even children's programming dehumanize Jews as monkeys and pigs without any rights or indigenous history, and glorify acts of martyrdom against them. It is these words, this incitement, that kills as much as weaponry does, and violent hatred targeting one group rarely ends there. There is, however, cause for hope. Just as no one, as we know, is born to hate, no one is born seeing someone else as subhuman or demonic, but is taught such ideas, one can also be taught acceptance and respect. Irrational and self-destructive hatred may well never fully go away. The search for scapegoats and the manufacturing of enemies can come reflexively to those facing internal crisis or lack of identity or purpose. But even recent history teaches us how potentially dramatically attitudes can, in fact, evolve. And we've seen it even in this country of yours. In 1965, Vatican reflection and outreach transformed nearly 2,000 years of Catholic-Jewish estrangement into substantial kinship. In our time, France and Germany, once sworn foes, are partners, and the United States, my country, calls not just Britain, from which it declared independence, but also World War II era adversaries, Japan and Germany, its closest of friends. And today, not only does Israel enjoy peace, at least at the state level, with Egypt and Jordan, but it also is quietly finding alignment with other key Arab states, putting greater emphasis, finally, on common interests than on past divides. In its pioneering of technology, its innovation of pathways to development, its cultural richness, and offering of humanitarian aid around the world, Israel is working to build bridges globally, including here in Africa. Now, to be clear, Israelis, who are only human too, and I can testify to that, are not immune to reasonable criticism. Neither individual Jews, any more or less than Christians or Muslims or Tutsi or Hutu. But if we are to avoid again repeating the worst of history in an era when globalization and social media combine with old prejudices to make new atrocities again seem justifiable to some, and that's all it takes, we need the moral clarity to call out incitement and dehumanization, let alone the violence that these inevitably promote. If we invest in educating children to peace, in seeing the commonality and the goodness of people, including those of a different religion, ethnicity, or skin complexion, we not only do our own descendants the favor of enabling a more habitable world, we uphold justice. And by remembering our own great traditions' call to love our neighbors as ourselves, we can rediscover that our own well-being is inevitably tied to that of others. Thank you very much.